Okay. So I was asked to give a presentation on VTrans involvement with the Monarch CCAA. This is a presentation that was put together by VHB consulting engineers and myself. A lot of credit goes out to Samantha Alger from VHB, who is a pollinator specialist with VHB. Okay. So here's our two pitchers who were it's supposed to be a co-presentation, but I'm just presenting today. So we're going to take you through the VTrans involvement with the nationwide CCAA from our initial interest for joining, the application process, mapping in the first year of monitoring, as well as some next steps for VTrans. I'm going to go in a little bit about our motivation for VTrans participation. VTrans had been following the development of the nationwide CCAA for the Monarch butterfly for a while, as we're always trying to be aware of potential T&E listings and how that might affect our operations. We saw that the CCAA as a good approach to streamline coordination for the future in preparation for a potential listing. One driving factor was that we could enter into this agreement utilizing mostly existing VMPs as conservation measures our districts already do in their everyday work. In turn, VTrans would then be provided assurances that no further conservation measures or permitting would be required if the species is listed as federally threatened or endangered. In retrospect, when the northern long-eared bat was listed as a federal threatened species, we had to scramble to get things in order, and it created a lot of angst amongst the agency for delivery of projects. Entering into this agreement will streamline the permitting effort when the time comes for the listing. The abundance of habitat along our rights-of-way serve as a conduit for the variety of pollinator species, including the monarch butterflies, and current conservation practices like rotational mowing and brush cutting along our right-of-way falls in line with the CCAA. VTrans senior management supported entering into the Monarch CCAA without hesitation. So now I'm just going to go into a little bit about the application process. We contracted VHB to assist us with this application. And Samantha Alger was the person that coordinated this with us and worked closely with us. We first needed to get internal buy-in. VTrans initially completed coordination internally for almost a year to determine different scenarios for VTrans to participate in the Monarch CCAA. To help gain support for the program, VHB assisted VTrans in creating a white paper on different enrolled land scenarios and conservation measures that aligned with maintenance operations. Once there was final agreement internally, we were able to move forward. Over the past year, we worked together to review current management practices, evaluate land holdings, identify opportunities and challenges to the Monarch CCAA program, and ultimately complete the application for enrollment. The application was formally submitted in April of 2020. The application went under review and was sent back for some minor revisions and then submitted again. VTrans recently obtained their final letter of inclusion on 9/23/2020. There we go. One of the first steps of the application was to identify the key threats to the monarch on VTrans land. As you may know, the key threats to monarchs include the loss of habitat through land conservation, herbicide use, and mowing practices. VTrans closely reviewed current management practices and identified where lies the biggest threats to monarchs here along Vermont roads. I should note here that herbicide was not identified as a key threat by VTrans, as current practices already greatly restrict the use of herbicides along our roadways. With the key threats identified, we reviewed VTrans' current management practices and identified practices that may already be working to support monarch populations and ways in which these practices might be improved upon and expanded. Through our research, we were able to identify 3 major conservation measures that fit well with VTrans' current management practices to support monarch butterflies. First, over the last few years, VTrans made changes to our mowing practices to employ a 3-year rotational mowing practice such that any given year, 2/3 of the lands remain idle, meaning that nectar-producing plants and milkweed are able to thrive in these idle lands. VTrans is committed to maintaining these idle lands along their highways through continued rotational mowing practices. I should also note that it is estimated that VTrans has saved roughly $800,000 a year through rotational mowing. That's an estimate. Through the removal of woody brush, open habitat is created, the kind of habitat where nectar-producing plants can grow, including milkweed. VTrans is committed to brush removal and tracking of this removal to continue to open habitat for monarchs. VTrans is also committed to developing pollinator-friendly seed mixes to restore and create habitat. This is something that VTrans has considered for some time, and we're now actively taking steps to make this happen. VHB is actually helping us develop these seed mixes and conducting seed trials. And it's our plan to next year use this widespread on our projects. VTrans is also committed to supplemental measures. These measures build confidence in the agreement and further show VTrans' commitment to support monarchs as well as pollinators. VTrans will map milkweed and wildflower patches along mowable right-of-ways and limited access roads to ensure these areas are conserved during mowing. VTrans currently has invasive species management, BMPs, and to reduce the spread into suitable habitat. Over the next 5 years, VTrans will review and update these BMPs as applicable. VTrans is working to develop an integrated vegetation management guide and will incorporate pollinator habitat focused. VTrans will leverage resources like the Monarch Joint Adventure Scorecard, Xerces Monarch breed, and milkweed surveys, and develop additional pollinator habitat monitoring protocols. So now I'm just going to go into a little bit about the mapping that went into this effort. As part of the agreement, all entities are committed to conducting conservation measures on a proportion of their lands. For DOTs, the target is 8%. In other words, VTrans need to commit to conducting conservation measures on 8% of our lands. Some of these calculations can be done on the back of an envelope calculations during the application process. VHB assisted VTrans with these calculations through GIS analysis. The two numbers we needed to figure out were the total enrolled lands and the acreage where conservation measures are being employed. The biggest conservation measure VTrans is employing is idle lands through our rotational mowing cycle. So we are going to focus on the mapping that was done to calculate idle lands. So under rotational mowing, 2/3 of the lands are not mowed in a given year and remain idle. So our challenge was to identify the location and acreage of these idle lands, but they had to be within good monarch habitat, open lands where milkweed and other nectar-producing plants can grow. For this mapping exercise, we targeted the limited access highways from monarch habitat since the rotational mowing cycle lent itself well to identifying habitat. We first identified the right-of-way for the limited access highway. We did this by pulling in data from the state parcel mapping. Following that, we used the new high-resolution land cover layer for Vermont. From this, we were able to identify the open land areas within the limited access right-of-way that were part of the 3-year rotation mowing cycle. We also took into account the clear zone along the highways that needed to be mowed each year. From this, we had an estimated total area of potential monarch habitat that may be mowed on a given year. Since VTrans keeps 1/3 of these lands mowed in every given year, we used a back of an envelope calculation to estimate the number of acres that will not be mowed and remain idle land within the potential monarch open habitat, which is identified in purple on this screen. VTrans decided to enroll all lands except rail infrastructure, as rail presents unique challenges with land holdings and lease agreements. As you can see, we have 42,534 acres consisting of these various property of limited access highways, airports, and additional miscellaneous lands around the state. In our adopted acreage, we have 3,403 acres, which was 8%. And mostly it was the idle lands, which was 2,850 acres, and 553 acres of brush removal. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the first year of monitoring that we did and share some of the results. VTrans and VHB completed 30 sites for biological effectiveness monitoring, 25 idle lands, and 5 brush cutting sites. The sites were randomly selected over the adopted acres throughout each of the VTrans districts. Each plot was roughly 10 foot by 150 foot. All sites were evaluated using the right-of-way habitat working group Tier 2 pollinator scorecard, which includes information about the nectar-producing plants, milkweed abundance, adjacent land uses, threats and opportunities for enhancement. Data was collected by VHB and VTrans staff using ArcGIS Online and Survey 123, which allowed us to use tablets and upload the scorecards into the pollinator habitat geodatabase. Each site took roughly 20 minutes to complete and was fairly straightforward. Overall, many of the sites had abundant pollinator plant species as well as pollinator species observed, including monarchs. Initial results, although, have found that 15 of the 30 sites evaluated did not meet the monitoring target, which will trigger adaptive management. We're currently looking at the 90% confidence interval option as well. We haven't quite figured out what we have there, but we may meet it through that. But VTrans overall, we're not too worried about that because it's not considered non-compliance under the CCAA. As it is effectiveness monitoring, we'll need to indicate how in the future monitoring success will be improved into the future. We're going to be working collaboratively with IRIS and the partners on developing adaptive management practices if need be. VTrans is in the final steps of completing all the surveys that were required. All the data has or will be uploaded into the national database and used for final report preparation. VTrans is currently in the process of developing additional pollinator-friendly seed mixes that can be included on future projects. Mapping efforts will likely be needed to identify large patches of milkweed and pollinator habitat along our rights-of-way. And training and awareness will need to occur throughout VTrans to ensure conservation measures are adhered to and documented. Public outreach will likely be an important piece of any plan moving forward, as well as collaboration with partners in the state and nationally. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions if I can.
Okay, sounds really good. Thank you, Glenn. Feel free to jump in with questions, everyone on the phone. Either speak up or chat in your question. We have one question here from Luz in California with Caltrans. She's wondering how and where are you finding milkweed seed, and is it a hydro seed mix?
We currently don't specifically plant just for milkweed around our rights of way. Some of the new seed mixes that we're going to be implementing do have milkweed in them. Typically in Vermont, we do a lot of hydroseeding and broadcasting along projects and stuff, but not specifically for just milkweed.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Stacy from Virginia is asking, what is meant by back of the envelope calculations?
Those were like simple calculations that were done just on like scratch paper. There wasn't anything like high tech that was involved in calculating the land.
Question here about restoration. Has anyone done restoration solely using plugs? And if so, what was your planting rate? So question to Glenn, or if there's anyone else on the phone. Yeah, go ahead, Glenn.
For VTrans, we have done some plugs, but I really don't. I just know that we've done it. I'm not the landscape architect that reviews these types of plans and stuff. If I could get back to you on that. Anyone else?
Hey, Aaron, this is Dan. I would say, typical plug spacing I've seen tends to be like 18 to 24 inches separation. Probably the highest you'd ever want to go, maybe 3 feet, but that's going to be a lot of room for weed pressure. So depending on the size of your planting, that can add up pretty quick to a lot of plugs.
Right. I'm a little freaked out by the number that I have via my calculations right now, which is why I was hoping somebody was going to give me some hope, but I don't think I'm going to get that. Dan, you're referring to small plugs, correct? Not like larger container plants?
Right.
Okay. Hey, Glenn, this is Erin in Illinois. Can I reach out to you about some more information on your hydro seeding projects?
Sure. I could actually give you some contact information in our construction section, because it's varied throughout the state which contractors actually do hydro seeding and which don't. So we could try to answer any questions that you would have.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other questions for Glenn?
Glenn, this is Dan. Just a quick question on your monitoring. So you mentioned that you had about half of your sites that contain milkweed, or that met the threshold. So hopefully with that 90% confidence interval, that'll demonstrate that you meet the thresholds there. But I was just curious, where you didn't see it, was it just a matter of the plot locations just didn't contain it, or I guess any insights that you gained from being out in the field on that?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Since the sites are selected randomly, we tried to draw in our monitoring plots before we actually went into the field. So when we got there could have been milkweed just outside the plot. Actually, a lot of it in some areas, but we just stuck with the random plot, and we just came up with 0 on some of them. Another problem that we ran into was we started monitoring prior to the latest release of the scorecard. Actually, it was re-released like 2 times during the monitoring that we're doing. So some of the data that we collected was in a range format instead of stems, and it would be like 10 to 50 stems of milkweed instead of 15 stems. So that there wasn't that option in the scorecard to put the actual stem count. So we had to give ranges on some of them. So when I'm calculating the confidence interval, I'm using the lowest range number on it's only like 10 of the sites that happened. So that was one problem we came about.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, unfortunate timing with our releases there, Glenn. Sorry about that. In the latest version, there is a field, as I'm sure you've noted, where you can enter like the actual count that you have. And that's both on the paper form of the scorecard as well as the survey 123 form.
Yeah, a majority of our sites we used the new one, but it was unfortunate that we had started it, like it was like a couple days, I think, before.
Yeah. Great. Okay, well, hey, thank you again, Glenn, for the case study. Thanks, Jake, as well, for your review of your recent report. I know we're at time here, so we'll wrap up.